At 4 in the morning on September 2, 1666, Thomas Farriner smelled smoke in his Pudding Lane bakery, and instead of fleeing, he reached for the water. In our timeline, that hesitation lasted seconds longer. The embers caught the stacked faggots in Thomas Ryder's yard next door, leapt to the thatch, and devoured 4/5 of the walled city in 4 days. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because sometimes the disaster that reshapes a city is not the one that burns it down. Sometimes it is the one that arrives 54 years later, carried in the hold of a ship, into streets that were never cleared. Farriner was baker to King Charles II's navy. He lived above his shop with his daughter Hannah and a maidservant, and by every account he was careful with his ovens. On this night, exhausted from a long summer's work in a city baked dry by months without rain, he raked his coals and banked them for the morning. Something smoldered. He woke. He moved. The fire died in its cradle. At dawn, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, Lord Mayor of London, heard of a minor scare on Pudding Lane and dismissed it with the phrase history remembers him for in our timeline, that a woman might piss it out. Only here, there was nothing left to piss out. The city slept on. But what no one in London understood that autumn, what would not become clear for 2 generations, was that the fire spared them only to leave them standing in the path of something worse. Without ruin, there is nothing to rebuild. The rebuilding acts of 1667 and 1670, which in our history imposed brick and stone on the city and widened its principal thoroughfares, are never drafted. Christopher Wren, 34 years old and newly returned from Paris, with sketches of Bernini's churches, submits his plans to reface old St. Paul's Cathedral on September 7th, exactly as he did in reality, and those plans are quietly accepted. He will refashion the west front. He will not redesign the skyline. The coal duty that in our timeline funded 51 new parish churches and the reconstruction of St. Paul's is debated in Parliament and then redirected. In June 1667, the Dutch sail up the Medway, burn the English fleet at Chatham, and tow away the Royal Charles. The humiliation consumes the Treasury's attention. Coal revenues are earmarked for naval recovery. The Corporation of London, jealous of its medieval privileges, resists any Crown-imposed building code. The livery companies, whose wealth sits in the timber warehouses along Thames Street, have no interest in mandated brick. Reform is discussed. Reform is shelved. The city that entered 1666 with jettied upper stories nearly meeting across its alleys enters 1670 with those same alleys unchanged. Through the last decades of the 17th century, London's population climbs past 500,000 souls, all pressed into the same medieval footprint bounded by the Roman wall and the Thames. Warehouses along Thames Street and Billingsgate rise higher on wooden frames, their upper floors cantilevered further out above the narrow lanes below. Parish vestries in St. Botolph Aldgate, St. Olave Southwark, and St. Catherine by the Tower administer an ever denser poor, packed into tenements where a single privy might serve 40 households. John Evelyn, who in 1661 had already described the coal smoke pall over the city in his pamphlet Fumifugium, writes privately to the Royal Society that London has become a wooden tinderbox waiting for a match. But his concern is fire. Robert Hooke surveys the riverside parishes and notes the impossibility of moving a coffin through certain lanes without tilting it sideways. No one in these years talks much about plague. The great mortality of 1665 has receded into memory. The bills of mortality, compiled by parish clerks and collated in the tradition John Grant established, show the usual background toll of fevers and consumptions. The city exhales, it forgets. In May 1720, as it did in our timeline, the Grand Saint Antoine drops anchor at Marseille after a voyage from the Levantine ports with a cargo of silk and cotton and at least one dead crewman in its hold. The ship should have been held in quarantine on the Ile de Jarre for 40 days. Commercial pressure from the city's silk merchants, bound for the Beaucaire Fair, reduces the quarantine to a formality. By July, Marseille is burying its dead in mass pits. By autumn, the plague has pushed inland through Aix and Toulon, reports reached the College of Physicians in London through correspondence with the medical faculty at Montpellier. Dr. Richard Mead, already a consulting physician of some standing, publishes a short discourse concerning pestilential contagion, arguing for strict maritime quarantine. Parliament debates a Quarantine Act. The Levant Company lobbies furiously to exempt its vessels from the most stringent provisions, citing the ruin of English commerce if Smyrna and Aleppo are treated as plague ports. The act passes in a diluted form. Enforcement falls to the Customs Service at the Port of London, whose inspectors are underpaid, overworked, and accustomed to the gratuities that make the system function. The warnings arrive. The defences are already porous. In late April 1721, a Smyrna trader named the Levant Merchant, her bill of health irregular and her master anxious, drops anchor in the Pool of London. Under the new Quarantine Act, she should ride at her moorings for 40 days below Gravesend. Her master bribes an inspector with 20 guineas and a bolt of watered silk. Her bales of cotton and her crew come ashore at Billingsgate over the course of 3 nights. The fleas that travel in the bales are not understood by anyone in 1721. Physicians of the college still speak the language of miasma and contagion, of bad air rising from damp ground, of pestilential particles carried on breath and cloth. They are not wrong about cloth. Within 6 weeks, the parish clerk of St. Botolph Aldgate records 11 unusual deaths in a single week, all swollen at the groin or neck. Across the river, St. Olave Southwark records 9 more. The word is not yet written in the bills, but in the tight lanes where the fire that wasn't would have cleared a firebreak, the sickness has found what it needs, people, and nowhere for them to go. By late June, the College of Physicians has confirmed what the parish clerks already know. The Privy Council, presided over by the ministers of the new King George I, orders a cordon around the eastern parishes. The plague orders of 1666 are pulled from the shelf and reissued almost unchanged. Houses with a confirmed case are to be shut up for 40 days. A red cross painted on the door, a watchman posted, the healthy sealed inside with the sick. In our timeline, those same orders had been imposed on a city that would, weeks later, be cleansed by fire. Here, there is no fire. The cordon fails almost immediately. The medieval lanes, too narrow for effective patrol, permit families to climb from back windows into neighboring attics. Watchmen are bribed or overwhelmed. The Thames watermen, forbidden to carry passengers across the river, carry them anyway for a shilling. By the first week of September 1721, the bills record more than 2,000 plague deaths a week. Sir Robert Walpole, newly consolidated as First Lord of the Treasury, reads the returns each morning and says little. The consequences of every deferred reform are compounding, but the worst months are still ahead. The cold of late autumn 1721 does what cold has always done to plague outbreaks. It suppresses the fleas without killing the bacterium in its rat reservoirs. Weekly mortality falls from its September peak. The Corporation of London congratulates itself prematurely. Merchants petition for the cordon to be lifted. Walpole, cautious, keeps it in place through Christmas and into the new year. In March 1722, as the weather warms, the outbreak resurges. It pushes west along the riverside into the liberties of the Tower, then north into Aldgate and Bishopsgate, then across London Bridge into Southwark's dissenting congregations, where the poorest of the poor have nowhere to flee. By the time the last cases are recorded in the autumn of 1722, roughly 70,000 Londoners are dead, approaching the toll of the 1665 plague, concentrated almost entirely in the unreformed riverside parishes that the 1666 fire, in another timeline, would have swept clean. The city that thought it had escaped its catastrophe learns that it had only postponed it and traded a disaster of property for a disaster of lives. The political aftermath moves faster than the plague did. Walpole's ministry, which had hesitated over the Quarantine Act, does not hesitate over Reconstruction. Between 1723 and 1727, Parliament passes a succession of statutes known collectively as the London Improvement Acts. Timber construction within the walls is forbidden outright. Street widening is mandated along the principal thoroughfares from Ludgate to Aldgate and along the entire riverfront. A permanent board of health is established, modelled on the intendants sanitaire that Marseille had created in the years after 1720. The Corporation of London, whose resistance to reform had lasted 60 years, acquiesces at last, because there is no constituency left to defend the old city. Christopher Wren is dead by then, having lived just long enough to see the outbreak begin. The rebuilding he imagined in September 1666, sketched on paper within days of a fire that never came, is carried out by his successors in brick and Portland stone across the 1730s. The new St. Paul's rises anyway, funded this time not by a coal duty for churches, but by a plague levy on the Port of London. The avenues broaden. The warehouses are rebuilt in brick. The medieval lanes disappear. The city that emerges by mid-century looks very like the city our timeline built after 1666, only it has cost 70,000 lives instead of the handful who died in the original fire. Every history of disaster teaches the same quiet lesson. The reforms a city refuses during its safe years are the reforms it pays for, at interest, during its dangerous ones. London simply paid later.